Good evening. You're watching a special edition of World News Tonight on TVP World. I'm Aaron Darman. We begin tonight with a stark message out of Kyiv as Volodymyr Zelenskyy says Ukraine faces the choice of losing a major partner or giving up the country's dignity. President Zelenskyy also insisting that he will not betray Ukraine, appearing to reject Washington's draft plan for peace. For more on this developing story, let's go straight to Kyiv, where our correspondent Oz Chatterjee is standing by. Good evening, Oz. So Donald Trump has given Ukraine a deadline of next Thursday. Is President Zelenskyy willing to negotiate with the United States?
Well, that's the line that we've heard from Donald Trump speaking to the press in the United States, that Thursday is the deadline for what is being called the Dmitriev-Witkoff plan with regards to this 28-point peace plan proposal that's been sent to the Ukraine that includes clauses in it that the Ukrainians have flat out rejected multiple times, as have the Europeans. These are Russian demands, the same demands that were at the start of the war being reissued again, this time with threats by the US if further reports reporting that the US is threatening to pull intelligence sharing and arms supplies to Ukraine should they not sign this deal by Thursday. President Zelenskyy putting out a statement on Friday, an extraordinary video statement filmed in front of the president's office. One might take your mind back to the start of the full-scale invasion, where Zelenskyy also stood outside that office and made his address that he would not be willing to back down and accept Russia's demands. So a similar message coming from Ukraine tonight, only this time concentrated at their nearest and best allies. So let's take a quick listen to that.
In the life of every nation, there comes a moment when honesty must come before everything else. Right now is one of the most difficult moments in our history. The pressure on Ukraine is among the strongest we have ever faced. We may find ourselves forced to choose, either losing our dignity or risking the loss of a key partner. We're facing either the difficult 28 points of the plan or an extremely hard, the most challenging winter ahead, along with other dangers. A life without freedom and dignity, without justice, and with expectations that we should trust someone who has attacked us twice. A response will be expected from us.
So it's very clear there that Zelenskyy is preparing the Ukrainian people for hardship and for further fallout between Washington and Kyiv should they not agree to this plan. Your first question to me was, are the Ukrainians trying and hopeful to negotiate about it? That was included in Zelensky's 10-minute speech, that the Ukrainians want American leadership and they want to talk to the Americans about this. But the context of this message really is preparing the Ukrainian people for the worst and the potential betrayal. He uses that word betrayal in his statement. And as he said, we did not betray Ukraine then, speaking to the start of the war. We will not do it now. So not a very thinly veiled message to how the Ukrainians see this particular proposal.
And this is all happening as Volodymyr Zelenskyy faces serious domestic troubles at home. Is his leadership on the line?
Well, look, you're quite right. Zelensky's coming back to a pretty difficult domestic situation with an anti-corruption graft probe into the state-owned nuclear power agency Energoatom, which has already claimed the jobs of the energy minister and the justice minister. Now, there are other people included in Zelensky's circle, including former defense minister Rustem Umerov, who are potentially implicated in this investigation. So this is a difficult moment for him. There have been calls from opposition parties for Zelenskyy to sack his closest aide, Andriy Yermak. He has so far resisted calls to do that. And he mentioned the difficult domestic situation in that 10-minute address to the Ukrainian people. But one thing I will add is the last time Zelensky was round in that Oval Office meeting, that infamous Oval Office meeting at the start of President Trump's second term in office, there was a effect of the people rallying around Zelensky, even his critics, because of the moment that the Ukrainians found themselves in. It's still too early to gauge public opinions from polls because this is still breaking news as it's developing. But I expect we'll find out in the next few days whether this will have the same sort of impact and whether the Ukrainian people will rally round the flag, will rally round the government in response to what is being widely perceived here in Ukraine and in Europe as a betrayal of the Ukrainian people and forcing on them concessions that they've already repeatedly rejected at the negotiating table with Russia, Aaron.
Oz Chatterjee, our correspondent in Kyiv, thank you. And as we go to air, reports are emerging that Ukraine's European allies, including France, Germany and the United Kingdom, are working on a counter to America's proposal. But what's in the original plan itself? Well, joining me in the studio is Kazimierz Szwiszek. Good evening, Kazimierz. So run me through what is on the table.
Good evening, Aaron. So the peace proposal from Washington contains 28 various points, and you can view all of them on our website, tvpworld.com. Keep in mind that these haven't yet been confirmed by any state officials. However, the whole world is talking about them, and we are as well. Let me break down some of the most crucial points for you right now, and also points which are raising the most questions. First of all, Ukraine would have to agree to some major territorial concessions. Crimea, Luhansk and Donetsk would have to be recognized as de facto Russian, while in Kherson and Zaporizhia the front line would be frozen along the point of contact. The size of the Ukrainian army would also have to be decreased to about 600,000 personnel, and that would be a decrease of about a third, as currently Ukraine has about 900,000 active soldiers, according to Statista.com. United States would also be providing security guarantees, but what exactly that would be, it still remains unclear. There would also be no NATO troops in Ukraine, and also NATO would write in its provisions that it would never accept Ukraine into its own ranks. So definitely a nod towards Russia here. And also, last but not least, there would be a full amnesty for both sides for their actions during the war. And this touches on a very, very divisive topic and a very delicate topic of Russian war crimes. We have the Ukrainian children and this would mean amnesty for all of that. But there are also other major points. So let's take a look at some of them here. So again, there will be also an exchange of prisoners and bodies between the two sides, but also Russia would have to return the kidnapped Ukrainian children. Again, here when we talked about the amnesty, now they would have to return the kidnapped children without any repercussions. There would also be an election in Ukraine in 100 days. That would mean Zelenskyy stepping away from the office of president. Russia would also be allowed to return to global economy. There would also be a lifting of sanctions on Russia. And last but not least, Ukraine would be reconstructed, so using partially Russian frozen assets, and the United States would receive about half of the profits from this reconstruction. These are some of the major points on this 28-point peace proposal from Washington. The reactions from European leaders were mixed. Generally speaking, they were rather reluctant to say anything strong about this peace proposal. We know that the United Kingdom, France and Germany are working on an alternative peace proposal. For now, we don't know much about that. But now let's listen to some of the statements from these European leaders that we've seen and heard throughout the day.
Well, I've just had a call with President Zelenskyy alongside President Macron and Chancellor Merz. And that was an opportunity for us to express again our support for Ukraine and the principle that's very important, which is all matters to do with Ukraine must be determined ultimately by Ukraine. Now, we all want a just and lasting peace. That's what the President of America wants. That's what we all want. And so we need to work from where we are to that end. But the principle that Ukraine must determine its future under its sovereignty is a fundamental principle.
Ukraine can count on us. Together with French President Emmanuel Macron and British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, I reaffirmed our full support to President Zelenskyy. We will coordinate closely with Europe and the US, whose commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty we welcome. The contact line must remain the basis for any talks.
Rewarding Russia's aggression will not make Ukraine, Europe, or the Indo-Pacific safer. Russia has no legal right whatsoever to any concessions from the country it invaded. Ultimately, the terms of any agreement are for Ukraine to decide.
Now, this is, of course, a developing story, so the lines are running hot between European leaders who are organizing calls after calls to discuss this peace proposal and what to do next. President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, said that tomorrow, on Saturday, European leaders will speak about this on the sidelines of the G20 summit. And there is also a new call that was announced by French Foreign Minister, a call which will include foreign ministers from Poland, Italy, Germany, the UK. But now let's take a look at the map of Ukraine. Let's see what exactly Ukraine would have to give up if it agreed to this proposal from the United States. So we can see here we have several regions where the fighting is going on. We have the regions of Luhansk, Donetsk and Crimea. These would have to be recognized as de facto Russian. And you can see that in Donetsk, this is where Ukrainians actually still have some territory. They would have to pull out of there and recognize it as de facto Russian. Now when it comes to Zaporizhia and Kherson, this is where the line would be frozen. How exactly that would be enforced is also unclear, but that's about 20% of Ukraine that Kyiv would have to give up. Like we said, this is a developing story, so we will bring you the latest updates, but for now, let's head back to the table with Aaron.
Watch this space. Kazimierz Wyszek, thank you so much. And in just a moment, we'll have an exclusive panel to break all of this down with former US Ambassador to Poland, Daniel Fried, and leading research fellow Ivana Stradna, right here on World News Tonight. In Warsaw, Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk is warning Washington not to go over his country's head in peace negotiations for Ukraine, saying all decisions concerning Poland will be made by its people. As Defense Correspondent Zuzanna Jurek reports, it comes after the US-backed deal slated a stationing of European jets on Polish soil.
All decisions concerning Poland will be made by the Poles. Nothing about us without us. When it comes to peace talks, all negotiations should include Ukraine. Nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine.
This was Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk's reaction to the US peace plan proposal for Ukraine. The 28-point document explicitly mentions there would be European fighter jets stationed on Poland's territory. A proposal which could threaten Poland's sovereign decision-making on its own defense.
It is obvious from what I'm reading right now, this some kind of a plan, or if you want ideas outlined on the paper, are quite disadvantageous to Ukraine and to European security.
Polish Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski said Europe's interests must be considered in the course of the negotiations.
As Europe, we demand to be included in these decisions. Also, it is not the victim's ability to defend themselves that should be limited, but the aggressor's ability to attack.
The gravity of the situation led Prime Minister Tusk to deliver a speech in the Polish parliament on Friday morning. Aimed at the right-wing opposition, along with the Eurosceptic President Karol Nawrocki, Tusk laid out what he called his 5 commandments.
Do not repeat the lies of Russian propaganda. Do not undermine trust in the Polish army and Polish security services, and do not interfere with their efforts. Do not weaken the state and its cohesion through legislative sabotage, including the modern Liberum veto. Do not undermine European unity. Be on the side of a strong West, not Russia. Stand by Ukraine in its war with Russia, without any ifs or buts.
The Prime Minister's statement comes in the wake of this week's Russia-linked explosions on Polish train lines, dubbed state-sponsored terrorism by Foreign Minister Sikorski.
When the intention of espionage and sabotage is to cause casualties, then we are no longer dealing with sabotage, but in fact with state terror. So, although this isn't what our response will be limited to, I have already decided to withdraw authorization for the operation of the Russian consulate in Gdańsk.
But not everyone agrees with that decision, including the leader of the far-right Confederation Party, Grzegorz Braun, who published a letter which he reportedly sent to the Polish foreign minister and his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, urging Warsaw and Kremlin to cease their hostile behavior against one another, while not condemning the latest act of Russian hybrid warfare. And while Poland is seeking to enforce Europe's interests, government officials emphasize it's key to first arrive at a consensus at home. For TVP World, Zuzanna Jurek.
Staying with our top story now, and joining me for an exclusive joint interview is former US Ambassador to Poland, Daniel Fried, and Ivana Stradna, leading research fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Good evening to you both.
Good evening.
Dobry wieczór. Good evening.
Mr. Ambassador, if I may start with you, Volodymyr Zelenskyy says Ukraine faces a choice between losing a major partner or its dignity. Is he effectively rejecting the deal as it stands?
President Zelenskyy is in a tight place, but he does have options. I think Ukraine is in a position to negotiate with the U.S. to discuss the text of the plan and to improve it. There are things, look, the draft peace plan is what we call in American English a hot mess. It's got inconsistencies, simply bad positions, a lot of Russian positions. But if you go through it, you can see how the Ukrainians might try to improve it, and it's probably worth their time to do so. So it's not a hopeless situation. I think President Zelenskyy has made the right call to suggest that he will work with the Americans to avoid blowing up relations with Donald Trump. I don't like that the Ukrainians are in this position. I don't like anything about how the draft U.S. plan was presented, but the Ukrainians can work with it if they act in a disciplined fashion, and I think they will have allies within the administration if they try.
Ms. Stradna, the ambassador there saying President Zelenskyy is indeed keen and willing to negotiate with America and Donald Trump. Donald Trump has given him until next Thursday. If we look at this proposal, Kyiv's NATO hopes gone, Ukrainian land handed over. I mean, what is the thinking in negotiating when these red lines are on the table?
I really do not understand how can you negotiate by removing bargaining chips. There is no way that we can trust that Putin is going to stop this war. He's going to use such negotiations to put Zelenskyy in a very uncomfortable situation, especially related to seizing territory, because Zelenskyy cannot say yes to that. And then Russia is going to take advantage of that and to claim, you see, it's not us, it's actually Ukraine. We are the ones that are a good partner with the United States. When I read the full 28 points, and I have to admit, I'm not surprised, because I've been following Russian demands for a very long time, and this is verbatim, one by one thing that Russia wanted to do. Of course, there is the problem with seizing territory. Then there is the second thing about security assurances. But that also, to me, seems very toothless. And Putin knows this. And Putin already challenged NATO, including here where you are sitting right now in Poland, related to, for instance, the latest drone incursions. The third point, lifting sanctions on Russia and portraying Russia as a reliable economic partner, it's another Russia's influence operations. Why? Because they know that Americans love to talk business. And this is a typical Kirill drafting point. Why? Because Putin also wants to use the next 1 year to replenish his military and to reposition and to continue. And this is precisely why I do not believe that Putin is willing to negotiate in good faith. I do believe that he makes such a plan in such a way to put Ukraine on the defensive and portray Russia as a reliable partner. Exactly, I fully agree with Ambassador that right now, Ukraine has to be rational, has to be collected, and has to know how to talk to the Trump administration.
Let's talk about that repositioning. Mr. Ambassador, some have drawn parallels between America's plan and the likes of the Munich and the Yalta agreements. I mean, is this the same situation? The US giving, in this case, Russia control of eastern Ukraine, but in effect casting the Kremlin's sphere of influence, I guess, across western Ukraine, across Europe at large. I'm also thinking about Poland here. We're sitting here just days after that railway sabotage attack.
You make some very good points. There is the whole American exercise of preparing this plan in such a sloppy and undisciplined way is a problem. And of course, for Poles or Czechs or Romanians, Lithuanians, this will look either like Munich or Yalta. I understand that perfectly. The question is what Ukraine should do in this current situation. I think they would be best advised to engage with the United States to try to improve this hot mess of a plan, and I think it can be improved. I think that it will not help Ukraine simply to reject it. I also think that there are many in the United States, in the Trump administration, who would be able and willing to work with Ukraine in good faith. Now, this is not, I don't come to this conclusion happily. I don't like what the Trump administration has done. I think it's a terrible mistake. But it doesn't matter what I think. The fact is, here we are. Ukraine has a choice whether to reject the plan entirely or to work with the United States to improve it. And if you look at the language of the plan, there are many ways in which it can be improved. And rather than think about Yalta or Munich, I'm thinking of the US-Ukrainian minerals deal that started out in terrible shape as something quite exploitative of Ukraine's economy, but ended up at a perfectly reasonable US-Ukrainian project for development. So if the Ukrainians are smart, and they are smart, they can do a decent job improving this text. Now, of course, I agree with the Polish foreign minister and the prime minister that the Polish interests have to be taken into account. I was in Poland earlier this week. I was there when news of the Russian sabotage against Polish railways came out. I would much prefer if the United States, Poland, NATO, and the EU were all working together to figure out what we were going to do to increase pressure on Russia after these latest attacks. But as a former diplomat, I'm trying to think of the best way forward to mitigate some of the damage of this draft and to avoid another blow-up between the United States and Ukraine. And I think there is a way forward, as unpleasant as this is.
So, Ms. Strodna, is there a valid argument here that concessions will need to be made, that Ukraine will need to accept some of those, including a loss of land, and perhaps, as Mr. Ambassador hints at there, that this plan might have legs, that it has merit to work with, especially perhaps with these NATO-style security guarantees? Is this somewhat of a blueprint to go forward with?
I think that Ukraine is not performing great on the battlefield. And we also have to take that into account what's happening right now and to put in the context what Ukraine is willing and not willing to give up. When it comes to the territory, to cede territory, that's going to be really, really hard for President Zelenskyy to accept. And Kyiv was very blunt about that in the past. And that's something that the Trump administration has to also taken into account. I think this particular 28-point document has to be taken as a starting point for negotiation. One of the best way really to negotiate with Russia, as they're asking maximalist demands, is to ask maximalist demands also from them and then take it from there. Let's also not forget that Russia absolutely has to return Ukrainian children. There are around 20,000 children over there. And we should absolutely not fall for the trick that Trump administration, unfortunately, is falling for, thinking that by putting Russia closer to the United States, that is going to divorce Moscow from Beijing. That is not going to happen because Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea are working together to dismantle the global order. That's why they are calling constantly about the creation of a multipolar world. And that thing doesn't have to happen with tanks and jets. It's about perception. That's precisely why the United States should realize that Russia is not our reliable partner. However, we also have to understand that Putin's economy is not going to be able to sustain this war after the end of 2026. And that's precisely why Russia needs right now a pause to replenish his military and to continue. Having said that, Russia is not also in a good situation to negotiate. And that's precisely what we should use as a leverage.
Ms. Stradner, the message out of Kyiv tonight is that Ukraine faces, quote, one of the most difficult moments of its history. If you look at the domestic situation in Kyiv as well, how much of this is Washington and Moscow trying to take advantage of President Zelensky's weakened hand at home, this bribery scandal in his own backyard, and exerting that pressure on him to just settle on a deal?
You're absolutely right. Look, we have to call a spade a spade. Ukraine has a problem with corruption, and we should not abandon that as a fact. However, why right now? And why the United States and Russia are using that right now to put a pressure on Zelensky? That's not fair, and Zelensky does have a huge problem out there. There are, I believe, two things right now that I see in Washington, D.C. Number one is indeed it's related to the corruption in Ukraine, but the second thing is also how they're using the Orthodox Church here, talking in Washington, D.C., that there is a persecution of Christians because they understand that that's something that resonates with the Trump administration. And I think it's extremely important to note that the Russian Orthodox Church has a long history of being a tool of the Kremlin. And there is a reason why Ukraine has abandoned the Russian Orthodox Church. So we also have to understand that it's not only the question of corruption that is lingering at the Hill, it's also the question of the Orthodox Church that Russia is pushing out there to put more pressure on Ukraine. And this is a typical influence operations. We should not fall for that.
Mr. Ambassador, is there a world where President Zelensky seeks some changes to this draft plan, where he actually agrees to the deal, says, look, it's the best we can do with Trump to end the fighting?
I think that is a possibility. That is, if you break the draft down into its component parts, many of them are fixable, some of them are weakly drafted but not bad, and only a few are simply wrong, and the Ukrainians should come back with counter proposals. There is some room to make this work. I don't think that President Trump is focused on the details of the plan. I think that Special Envoy Witkoff is not sure of the details himself. I think if Zelensky is in a position to tell Trump that he embraces the plan, he just wants to work with Trump and negotiate, Trump might appreciate it. There may be a way for Zelensky to come up and his government to come up with alternative language which satisfies Trump, which frustrates the Kremlin's ambitions. This is not a position I wish we were in. As I said, we should be deciding what we do to push back against Russian sabotage against Poland and against other European countries, what we can do to pressure Russia for a better deal on Ukraine. But we are where we are, and my former profession of diplomat had the responsibility of trying to work through seemingly impossible situations like this one.
And we are running out of time, but I want to ask you about that former career, because as a former US ambassador in Poland, I want to ask about this clause that says European fighter jets will be stationed here in Poland. Prime Minister Donald Tusk has hit back, saying Poles will decide what happens in Poland. What does it tell us when Washington and Moscow appear to be striking agreements above Warsaw's head, especially ones that could limit foreign forces on the eastern flank?
Well, I've got two answers. One is that the Prime Minister is absolutely right to object to the United States making commitments about Poland. Okay, Donald Tusk is right. My second point is that this is actually not substantively a bad clause. There are European Air Forces, in fact, American warplanes ought to be stationed in Poland. They ought to be able to work with Poland to help it provide security as a NATO member. So the form and the whole process of talking about Poland without Poland is foolish and harmful. the actual substance of this clause is not terrible. It actually works in the interests of Ukraine and in the interests of Poland. So I understand the Polish objection, but it is one of the less objectionable things in this draft agreement, I'm afraid.
Now, lastly, I want to ask you both the same question, and your answers will need to be brief, I apologise. But point 26, right down the bottom of this plan, notes that, quote, all parties involved in this conflict will receive full amnesty for their actions during the war and agree not to make any claims or consider any complaints in the future. Is Washington asking Ukraine to wipe the last 4 years of history and, above all, to forget about what the United Nations has called crimes against humanity? Ms. Stradner, we can start with you.
I think it's very important to know that Ukraine should absolutely not abandon to what has happened for the past 4 years. As a matter of fact, it's something that we should absolutely remind ourselves of the Russian aggression. Make no mistake, the United Nations cannot stop wars, and we should not be naive about that. But definitely, we should not also seize the opportunity to remind the world of Russian illegal activities in Ukraine.
And now, Mr. Ambassador, is this deal a cleansing of history?
Is this deal a what of history?
A cleansing of history as it stands.
I think this deal is a mess as it currently stands. It is something that can be worked with, because it has some elements that could be shaped, and because I think the U.S. administration is not at all committed to this deal in its details. So I think there is a place for Ukraine to push back and make this work and avoid a blow-up with the U.S. I wish we weren't here. I wish my own government was in a better position on Ukraine, but this is something that can be worked, however regrettable it is.
Former US Ambassador to Poland, Daniel Fried, and Ivana Stradner, Research Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Thank you both so much for your time.
Thank you.
And that's all for World News Tonight. Do stay with us here on TVP World for the very latest. I'm Aaron Darman. Good night.